Alright, so my opponent Gavin here mentioned that the desire for legal physician suicide is unrelated to healthcare costs. This debate is not really talking about healthcare costs, it's really talking about legality issues of the Oregon model. Now, a few studies here about places that have taken place with legality issues of euthanasia. There's been a study in the Netherlands that shows 1,040 people, an average of 3 per day, died from involuntary euthanasia, meaning that doctors killed patients without the patient's knowledge or consent. 14% of those patients were fully competent. 72% have never been given indication that they wanted to even end their lives. 8% of all those cases, doctors performed involuntary euthanasia despite the fact that they believed alternative options were still possible. Now, I.J. Kwon also mentioned here, the overwhelming majority of Dutch euthanasia cases, doctors, in order to avoid additional paperwork and scrutiny from local authorities, deliberately falsify patients' death certificates stating that deaths occurred in natural cases. Now, also with Oregon's Death with Dignity Act in 2006, the annual report was taken. And even more chilling is the fact that Death with the Dignity Act applies no penalties to doctors who report that they've prescribed lethal drugs for purpose of suicide. This means there's no way to know for sure how many assisted suicide deaths there actually may be occurring in Oregon. Also, now, doctors have to be trained to fully assess a patient that has chosen euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide by looking at a person's autonomy as well as a patient's life expectancy. Such aspects of any patient can never be determined as a fact. Many patients that are diagnosed with serious cancers or diseases that are expected to have a short life expectancy can live with the expected time, if not longer, with the correct hospice care. Doctors have a job to do, and this is one of which to keep their patients alive and as pain-free as possible, not murder or suicide as a cheaper and alternative route. This was written here in the UK. Euthanasia is still illegal in the UK, but the application of the law is not always clear. For example, although doctors in the UK are not allowed to give treatment that causes death, doctors can withhold artificial nutrition and hydration, defined by the British Medical Association as life-prolonging treatments, if they believe that this would be in the patient's best care. Another reason to why, euthanasia is not possible to be controlled once it has become legal. Also, in Oregon's Death with Dignity Act, according to Herbert Enning, a survey of Oregon's physicians who received the first 142 requests of assisted suicide showed that the physicians recommended 13% of patients for optional palliative care, while the rest of 87% had either option for euthanasia or didn't push for palliative care. Edmund Peligro, a professor of medicine and medical ethics, says, "In a society obsessed with the cost of healthcare and the principle of utility, the dangers of the slippery slope are far from a fantasy." This goes hand in hand with the fact that drugs for assisted suicide cost, which is cheap, from $35 to $45, whereas medical costs for hospice care and palliative care are much more expensive. This goes to show that doctors who claim to help patients out choose involuntary euthanasia over alternative methods for proper care by financial pressures, which does not stand a legal point in Oregon's Death with Dignity Act. Also, coming to talk about the slippery slope, there is actually a very high chance of slippery slope, just like I mentioned earlier. Also, over the past 2 decades, Dutch law and Dutch medicine have evolved from accepting assisted suicide to accepting euthanasia, and from euthanasia for terminally ill patients to euthanasia for chronically ill individuals. It then evolved from euthanasia for a physical illness to euthanasia for psychological distresses. Finally evolved from voluntary euthanasia to a practice in conditional acceptance of non-voluntary and involuntary euthanasia. Once the Dutch is permitted assisted suicide, it was not possible medically, legally, or morally to deny more active help such as euthanasia to individuals who could not affect their own deaths. Now here's a good study that was taken fairly recently, actually April of last year. On March 28th, has reported that Dr. Virginia Soares de Souza has been charged with 7 counts of murder and has killed 300 patients in order to reportedly free up beds. This does not sound familiar. It has been suggested that de Souza could be one of the world's biggest serial killers. Also, this goes hand to hand where the Dutch take a legal medical procedure, hasten the death of patients who is terminally ill, rather than providing the correct and more difficult hospice care to the patient in order to see the patient's pain. It becomes an easier and faster solution to a serious illness, which becomes an accepted treatment, ultimately ending in a slippery slope of involuntary euthanasia. Herbert Hending also said, the inability to regulate euthanasia within established rules is even more slippery. Virtually every guideline established by the Dutch, whereas voluntary, well-considered, persistent requests, intolerable suffering that cannot be relieved, consultation, or the reported case, has failed to protect the patient's rights or has been modified or violated with impunity. Study found that in spite of the fact that medical care is provided to everyone in Holland, palliative care or comfort care programs with adequate pain control techniques and knowledge were poorly developed, rather than they just fall back on euthanasia. Now, Oregon is sliding down the same slippery slope as did the Netherlands. Once killing is redefined from bad to good, the protective guidelines for assisted suicide, which advocates assure us will keep the practice of hastening death is corralled, are also quickly redefined, at least in practice, as obstacles to be overcome. They are attacked, ignored, or reinterpreted, while potential violations go essentially uninvestigated, to the point where they become eventually irrelevant. Many physicians are unwilling to write lethal prescriptions in Oregon, causing at least one HMO to make an email plea to enlist other doctors who are willing to act as the attending physician for patients requesting assisted suicide. Basically, it's a concrete fact show that the Dutch, as well as the Oregon model of euthanasia, is not able to be monitored and controlled as well as it says it could be controlled. Euthanasia is not just a medical procedure, but rather a legal form of suicide that will be uncontrolled, and murder should not be legal and